In the winter of 1925, two of Chicago's most dangerous men sat across from each other in the back room of a shuttered bakery on the west side. The meeting was so secret that neither man's closest lieutenants knew it was happening. Both men had spent years trying to kill each other. Now they were about to shake hands and become partners. Al Capone represented the Italian South Side. Dean O'Malley controlled the Irish North Side. Between them, they had orchestrated dozens of murders, controlled hundreds of speakeasies, and commanded armies of men who would kill without question. But on this frozen February night, neither man was thinking about territory or revenge. They were thinking about survival. Because something had changed in Chicago's underworld, something that threatened to destroy both their empires unless they found a way to work together. This is the story of that alliance. A dramatized account of what happens when necessity forces natural enemies to become unlikely partners, when trust becomes a luxury neither side can afford, and when the most dangerous betrayal comes not from your enemies, but from the friends you thought you could count on. By 1925, Chicago's organized crime had evolved into something more complex than simple gang warfare. The success of Prohibition had attracted new players to the game, not just local criminals, but sophisticated operators from New York, Detroit, and Kansas City who saw Chicago as the prize worth claiming. Al Capone had built his empire methodically, taking over from Johnny Torrio and expanding operations beyond anything the city had seen before. His organization controlled the South Side, parts of downtown, and most of the suburban areas where wealthy residents wanted their liquor delivered discreetly to their back doors. But Capone's success had also made him a target. The Italian families in New York were questioning why a nobody from Brooklyn should control the most profitable territory in the Midwest. The Sicilian Old Guard in Chicago resented taking orders from someone they considered an outsider. Even within his own organization, ambitious lieutenants were beginning to wonder if Al Capone was still the right man to lead them into an uncertain future. Dean O'Malley faced different but equally serious challenges. The Irish gangs had controlled Chicago's North Side since before Prohibition, but their power was fragmenting. O'Malley commanded respect from the older generation of Irish criminals, but younger Irish gangsters were increasingly willing to work with whoever paid the best, regardless of their heritage. More troubling, federal pressure was increasing. The government was finally taking organized crime seriously, and the Irish gangs' traditional connections to local police weren't enough to protect them from federal investigations. O'Malley needed new resources and new strategies if he was going to keep his organization intact. The crisis that brought Capone and O'Malley together came from an unexpected source: the Eastman Syndicate, a sophisticated criminal organization from New York that had decided to expand into Chicago. Led by a man named Samuel Rothstein, the Eastman Syndicate wasn't like the local gangs that had grown up organically in Chicago's neighborhoods. They were businessmen first, criminals second. They had connections to legal businesses, political figures, and financial institutions that neither Capone nor O'Malley could match. Rothstein's strategy was simple but effective: divide and conquer. He began by approaching smaller gangs in both Italian and Irish territories, offering them better terms than they were getting from their current leadership. Protection money was reduced. Territory boundaries were relaxed. Independent operators were welcome, as long as they paid a modest percentage to the syndicate. The message was clear: the old system of ethnic territories and blood loyalty was obsolete. The future belonged to whoever could run crime like a business rather than a tribal war. Within 6 months, Rothstein had recruited nearly 30% of the criminals operating in Chicago. He had also begun systematic assassination of gang leaders who refused to join his new organization. 3 of O'Malley's top men had been killed in carefully orchestrated hits. 2 of Capone's lieutenants had disappeared without a trace. The approach came through an intermediary both men trusted: Father Patrick McDonough, an elderly priest who had grown up in the neighborhoods where both gangs operated and who had buried more than his share of young men killed in gang violence. Father McDonough understood that sometimes preventing greater evil required accepting smaller compromises. When he arranged the meeting between Capone and O'Malley, he wasn't endorsing their activities, but he was acknowledging that their destruction would lead to something far worse for the people he served. "There's a cancer growing in this city," Father McDonough told each man separately. "It's called the Eastman Syndicate, and it will consume everything you've built unless you find a way to stop it together." Capone's first reaction was skepticism. "Why would O'Malley want to work with me? We've been trying to kill each other for 5 years." "Because," the priest said, "Dean O'Malley is losing men the same way you are. Because this Rothstein character doesn't care about Irish or Italian territories. He wants it all. And because sometimes a man's worst enemy can become his most reliable ally when they're both facing something that threatens to destroy them completely." The priest delivered the same message to O'Malley, who had a different but equally predictable response: "I don't trust Capone. How do I know this isn't some elaborate setup to get me in a room where his people can finish me off? You don't, Father McDonough said. But you know this. If Al Capone wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. The fact that you're both still alive while your men are being picked off one by one should tell you something about what you're really facing. The bakery where they met had been closed for 2 months, a victim of the same economic pressures that were reshaping Chicago's criminal landscape. Father McDonough had borrowed the keys from the landlord, promising only that the space would be returned in the same condition. Al Capone arrived first, accompanied by Frank Nitti and one bodyguard. He wore a conservative dark suit and carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling situations through presence rather than violence. Dean O'Malley arrived 15 minutes later with his own small entourage. At 62, he was nearly 20 years older than Capone, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen Chicago grow from a frontier town into a modern city. He walked with a slight limp from a bullet wound he'd received in 1919, but his eyes were sharp and alert. The two men studied each other for a long moment before Capone extended his hand. Dean, Al. They shook hands briefly, then sat across from each other at a table that still smelled faintly of flour and yeast. I assume, O'Malley said, that you're having the same problems I'm having with these New York people. They killed Tommy Romano last week, Capone said. Made it look like a robbery, but I know better. That's the 4th man I've lost to these bastards. I've lost 6, and they're not just killing leaders, they're recruiting our best people, offering them deals we can't match. What kind of deals? Better territory, better percentages, connections to legal businesses we don't have access to. They're making it look like the smart play is to abandon the old system and join their organization. Capone nodded slowly. They approached Frank Nitti last month, offered him twice what I pay him, plus a piece of their New York operations. Both men understood what this meant. If the Eastman Syndicate could recruit their top lieutenants, the war was already over. So O'Malley said, "What do you propose we do about it?" The alliance they negotiated was unlike anything Chicago's underworld had seen before. It wasn't a merger or a takeover, but a carefully structured partnership that respected both organizations' autonomy while creating mechanisms for cooperation. Territory would remain divided along traditional lines, but both organizations would share intelligence about syndicate activities. Any attack on one group would be considered an attack on both. Most importantly, neither side would recruit from the other's organization or attempt to expand into the other's territory while the alliance was active. This isn't friendship, O'Malley made clear. This is business. When the syndicate threat is eliminated, we go back to being competitors. Understood, Capone agreed. But while this lasts, we watch each other's backs. The most delicate part of the negotiation involved their respective police connections. Both organizations had relationships with corrupt officers and political figures, but those relationships were often exclusive. Sharing that information would make both sides vulnerable if the alliance failed. They solved this problem by creating a third entity, a supposedly independent security firm that would coordinate their activities without either side having to reveal their specific sources. Father McDonough agreed to serve as the neutral intermediary who would pass information between the organizations. One more thing, Capone said as they prepared to finalize their agreement. How do we handle it when our people start killing each other? Because that's going to happen. We've got too much history, too many grudges. O'Malley thought for a moment. We handle it the same way we handle disputes within our own organizations. The leaders sit down and work it out. Violence is the last resort, not the first one. They shook hands again, this time with more formality. Both men understood they were crossing a line that they might not be able to step back over, but they also understood that their alternatives were limited. For the first 6 months, the alliance worked exactly as planned. Information flowed between the organizations, allowing both sides to anticipate and counter syndicate moves. Joint operations disrupted Rothstein's recruiting efforts and eliminated several of his key operatives in Chicago. Most importantly, the alliance sent a message to the broader criminal community. The old territorial system still had teeth. Criminals who had been considering defecting to the syndicate began to reconsider when they realized that defection might mean facing both the Italian and Irish organizations simultaneously. Rothstein responded by escalating his tactics. Instead of trying to recruit existing criminals, he began importing gunmen from New York to eliminate key figures in both organizations. The assassination attempts were sophisticated and well-funded, but they were also predictable to organizations that were sharing intelligence effectively. In August of 1925, the alliance achieved its first major victory when they successfully ambushed a syndicate hit team that had been sent to kill both Capone and O'Malley during a supposed peace meeting. The ambush was so well coordinated that it appeared the two organizations had been working together for years rather than months. But success created its own problems. Some members of both organizations began to question why they were fighting the syndicate at all. If cooperation was so profitable, why not make it permanent? Why not merge the organizations entirely and divide Chicago between them permanently? The first crack in the alliance appeared in October of 1925, when one of O'Malley's men, Patrick "Paddy" Sullivan, approached Frank Nitti with a proposition that neither leader knew about. Sullivan had been watching the profits generated by the cooperation between the organizations. He'd also been watching the profits that both sides were missing because they were expending resources fighting the syndicate instead of maximizing their existing operations. What if, Sullivan asked Nitti, there was a way to eliminate both problems at once? What if we could get rid of the syndicate and restructure the alliance at the same time? What are you talking about? I'm talking about a deal with Rothstein, not joining his organization, but buying him out. The syndicate has been bleeding money on the Chicago operation. They're getting pressure from New York to either succeed quickly or withdraw. What if we offered them a face-saving exit that also eliminated the competition? Nitti was interested despite himself. What kind of exit? We pay them for the territory they've already claimed. We compensate them for their losses, and we guarantee safe passage out of Chicago for their remaining people. In exchange, they abandon their expansion plans and agree not to return. And then what? And then we restructure the alliance. Instead of two separate organizations cooperating temporarily, we create one organization with two divisions, Irish operations and Italian operations, but unified leadership and shared profits. It was an elegant solution to multiple problems. The syndicate threat would be eliminated without continued warfare. The alliance would be formalized in a way that maximized profits for both sides, and ambitious men like Sullivan and Nitti would have opportunities for advancement that didn't exist in the current structure. There was only one problem. Neither Al Capone nor Dean O'Malley would ever agree to such an arrangement. Sullivan and Nitti began meeting secretly with Rothstein's representatives in November of 1925. The negotiations were complex, involving not just territorial agreements, but financial arrangements that would compensate the syndicate for their Chicago losses while providing incentives for them to abandon their expansion plans. Rothstein was interested for several reasons. The Chicago operation had indeed been more expensive than anticipated. His New York partners were questioning the investment, and the alliance between Capone and O'Malley had proven more effective than anyone had expected. But Rothstein also saw an opportunity. If he could make a deal with middle management from both organizations, he might be able to eliminate the current leadership entirely and install people who would be more amenable to syndicate influence in the long term. Here's what I propose, Rothstein told Sullivan and Nitti during a meeting in December. We pay you to handle the leadership problem. We provide the resources and the planning. You provide the access and the execution. When it's over, you run Chicago the way we would have run it, but you get to keep the profits. Sullivan and Nitti understood what he was suggesting. They were being offered the chance to eliminate their own bosses and take control of the entire Chicago operation. What about the alliance? Nitti asked. What alliance? When this is over, there won't be separate organizations to have an alliance between. There will just be Chicago, and you'll be running it. Al Capone learned about the secret negotiations the way he learned about most betrayals, through a source he'd never expected. Father McDonough had been serving as the intermediary for alliance communications, which meant he saw all the intelligence both sides were sharing. When patterns in that intelligence stopped making sense, he began conducting his own investigation. What the priest discovered was that information was flowing in directions it shouldn't be flowing. Details about alliance operations that were known only to top leadership were somehow reaching syndicate operatives. The priest's investigation led him to Patrick Sullivan, and from Sullivan to the broader conspiracy. Father McDonough faced the most difficult decision of his life. He had helped create the alliance because he believed it would reduce violence in his community. Now he was discovering that the alliance itself was being used as a weapon to plan the greatest violence of all. The priest chose to approach Al Capone first, partly because Capone's organization seemed to have more resources for dealing with the situation, but mostly because Father McDonough had concluded that Frank Nitti was less committed to the betrayal than Patrick Sullivan was. There's something you need to know, the priest told Capone during a private meeting in December of 1925. Your alliance with the Irish is about to be used to destroy both of you. Capone listened quietly as Father McDonough explained what he had discovered. When the priest finished, Capone was silent for several minutes. Does O'Malley know? Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. Why? Because I think this situation can still be salvaged. Sullivan is the real problem. Nitti seems to be going along with something he doesn't fully understand. If you handle this correctly, you might be able to save the alliance and eliminate the real threats at the same time. What happened next demonstrated why Al Capone had become the most powerful criminal in Chicago. Instead of immediately moving against Frank Nitti, or warning Dean O'Malley about Patrick Sullivan, Capone chose a more complex strategy that would eliminate multiple threats simultaneously. Capone arranged for Dean O'Malley to accidentally discover evidence of the secret negotiations. But the evidence was carefully crafted to make it appear that the betrayal was entirely Nitty's idea, and that Sullivan had been recruited by Nitty rather than being an equal partner in the conspiracy. At the same time, Capone approached Rothstein directly, claiming that he had discovered the conspiracy and was willing to eliminate both O'Malley and his own traitorous lieutenant in exchange for a formal partnership with the syndicate. The beauty of Capone's strategy was that it required everyone to act according to their nature. O'Malley would be outraged by the apparent betrayal and would move against Sullivan. Rothstein would be suspicious of Capone's sudden change of heart, but would be intrigued by the possibility of achieving his goals without further warfare. Nitty would be trapped between his loyalty to Capone and his involvement in the conspiracy. The resolution came in January of 1926, during a meeting that was supposed to finalize the arrangements between Sullivan, Nitty, and Rothstein's representatives. The meeting took place in a warehouse on the south side, in what was supposedly neutral territory. Sullivan and Nitty arrived expecting to conclude their arrangements with Rothstein. Instead, they found themselves facing Al Capone, Dean O'Malley, and a dozen armed men from both organizations. "Gentlemen," Capone said, "I think we need to discuss the future of Chicago." The confrontation lasted less than 10 minutes. Sullivan, realizing he had been outmaneuvered, attempted to draw a weapon and was shot by one of O'Malley's men. Nitty, who had never been fully committed to the betrayal, immediately surrendered and provided complete details about the syndicate's plans. Rothstein's representatives, who had been waiting in a nearby building for confirmation that the conspiracy had succeeded, found themselves surrounded by Alliance forces, who had been positioned there hours earlier. The message that was sent to New York was clear: the Eastman Syndicate's expansion into Chicago was over. Any further attempts to challenge the alliance would be met with unprecedented cooperation between organizations that had just proven they could set aside decades of animosity when their survival was at stake. The alliance between Al Capone and Dean O'Malley continued for another 2 years, longer than anyone had expected when it was first formed. The syndicate threat was eliminated, but both organizations discovered that cooperation was often more profitable than competition. However, the experience had changed both men in ways that made the long-term success of their partnership impossible. Capone had learned that betrayal could come from within his own organization, and he became increasingly paranoid about the loyalty of his subordinates. O'Malley had learned that the old ethnic loyalties that had sustained the Irish gangs were breaking down, and he began planning for a retirement that would come sooner rather than later. Frank Nitty's survival of the conspiracy actually strengthened his position within Capone's organization. His willingness to confess his involvement and provide intelligence about syndicate operations demonstrated a practical loyalty that Capone valued more than personal affection. The alliance formally ended in 1927, when territorial disputes between the organizations became too numerous to resolve through negotiation. But it ended without the violence that had characterized their relationship before 1925. Both sides had learned that their real enemies were not each other, but outside forces that threatened the stability of Chicago's criminal ecosystem. Years later, during his imprisonment at Alcatraz, Al Capone would often think about the alliance with the Irish and what it had taught him about the nature of power and loyalty. "People think the hardest thing about running an organization is dealing with your enemies," he told a fellow prisoner during one of their conversations. "But that's not true. Your enemies are predictable. They want to destroy you, and they act accordingly. The hard part is dealing with your friends, because they want things from you that you can't give them, and they resent you for it." What about the Irish, O'Malley's people? O'Malley understood something most people don't understand, that cooperation doesn't require friendship, just shared interests. "We never pretended to like each other, so we never had to deal with the disappointment that comes when friendship fails." Capone was quiet for a moment, looking out through the bars at the San Francisco Bay. "The betrayal didn't come from O'Malley. It came from within my own organization, from people who thought they could get a better deal by selling out everyone they'd worked with. That's the lesson I should have learned earlier. The most dangerous enemy is always the one who knows your weaknesses best." The alliance between Al Capone and the Irish mob was one of the most unusual partnerships in the history of organized crime. It succeeded because both sides understood that it was temporary, practical, and based on necessity rather than trust. But it also revealed something important about the nature of loyalty and betrayal in any organization, criminal or legitimate. The greatest threats often come not from external enemies, but from internal allies who believe they can achieve more by abandoning their current relationships than by honoring them. Al Capone's ability to turn the conspiracy against him into a weapon against his real enemies demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that made him successful for so long. But it also demonstrated the exhausting vigilance required to maintain power when trust becomes a luxury you cannot afford. The story of the secret deal with the Irish mob is ultimately a story about adaptation and survival. When the rules of the game changed, both Capone and O'Malley were able to change with them. When betrayal threatened to destroy them both, they found a way to use that betrayal to eliminate their enemies and strengthen their own positions. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson of their alliance, that survival often requires temporary partnerships with people you don't particularly like, in order to defeat people who pose an existential threat to everything you've built. The key to making such partnerships work is understanding that they are partnerships, not friendships, and that their success depends on each side getting what they need rather than what they want.